Okay, well, the topic today, light, love, action. No, light, love, power, presence. You might recognize those four words from our prayer for protection, which we use to close our service each Sunday, and we do that probably along with the majority of Unity centers around the world. You don't find too many things in Unity that have that kind of universal application, because we really don't go in for a lot of repetitive rituals and rote prayers and things like that. The problem with those things is they can become more of a meaningless habit instead of being a meaningful statement of truth. So every now and then it's a good idea to take a look at these things in depth and kind of, shall we say, deconstruct them and decide if they still work. Now that's one of the major differences between Unity and the old-time religions. If you're tired of that old-time religion, come to Unity, because most religious institutions, they don't let you question anything. Have you noticed? It's difficult. If you ask why they do a particular thing or teach a particular thing, the most common answer you get is, that's the way we've always done it. And as far as I'm concerned, that's never an acceptable answer, just because that's the way we've always done it. So, here's our question for today. Why the prayer for protection? How did it become so ubiquitous? I'm going to bet that most of you probably don't know the history of the prayer for protection. And in the grand scheme of things, it's not all that old. It was written by this guy here, James Dillett Freeman, who used to be the director of Silent Unity. He was the director of the old Unity Ministerial School for years, and he's also been called the poet laureate of the Unity movement. I think that's the thing he's best known for, is his poetry. He's published many times over, and as you're going to hear, his poems have been to some rather famous places. Well, back in 1940, he was asked to write a special Christmas prayer service for the workers at Silent Unity. And if you're not familiar with what Silent Unity is, that's our telephone prayer ministry. It's the telephone prayer ministry of the Unity movement that operates out of Unity Village in Missouri. It's the first and the oldest continuously operating 24/7 telephone prayer ministry in the world. And so at Christmas time in 1940, he was going to write the Christmas service for them. And think about Christmas 1940, what was going on in the world at that time. Now, the United States wasn't at war yet, but the war was raging in Europe and many other places. Germany was bombing London, and things were really starting to look ominous. And everyone knew that it was just a matter of time before the rest of the world got dragged into the conflict. So Jim Freeman gave an interview not too long ago for Unity Magazine before he died, and this is how he described the process. He said, we had never before needed a prayer for protection, but in 1940 we needed one. So I wrote one to go with the Christmas service. What I wrote was a little 4-line verse. The light of Christ directs me, the love of Christ enfolds me, the power of Christ protects me, the presence of Christ upholds me. That doesn't sound like the prayer for protection, does it? What you have here is the first draft of the prayer for protection that was used in that Christmas service for the Silent Unity workers back in 1940. And they liked it so much that they asked Jim Freeman to write a pamphlet that they could send to people around the world containing different affirmative prayers for protection. So he wrote this pamphlet that was entitled His Protecting Spirit. Now, at this point, you might be noticing a bit of a trend. There's a definite masculine and Christian bias there so far, right? And no surprise, really. 1940 was an entirely different culture, not just in this country, but in the Unity movement. Actually, one of the affirmative prayers that Jim Freeman wanted to include in this pamphlet was a line from the King James Version of Psalm 23. all right, it was this one that goes like this. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. We don't use the King James Version any longer as our preferred translation of the Bible, and that's because nobody writes or talks like that anymore. Can you think of anyone who would be shouting, "Yay!" while they're walking through the valley of the shadow of death? Hey, yay! It's the shadow of death. Yippee! It's like. And fortunately, they had some really good editors at Silent Unity back then, and someone who had been reading the draft of the pamphlet came up to Jim and said to him, "Jim, if I were a woman in England and they were dropping bombs on my roof, or if I were a soldier and someone was pointing a loaded gun at me, I wouldn't want to feel like I was walking through the valley of the shadow of death. Can't you do better than that?" And that's when it came to him to write a new version of that prayer that he wrote for the Silent Unity Christmas service. And the new one went like this, very simply. The light of God surrounds me. The love of God enfolds me. The power of God protects me. The presence of God watches over me. Period. He changed the word Christ to God so that it would be more acceptable to people around the world, because that was the idea, was to distribute this worldwide. That's the way it was first printed in 1941. Just those 4 lines. And then it was at the time of the second printing in 1943 that he added that last 5th line that is so familiar to us. Wherever I am, God is. Thousands of soldiers and civilians carried that around with them during World War II, and it's endured for long afterward. In more recent times, probably some of you have heard that it was carried by Buzz Aldrin on Apollo 11 when he became the second person to walk on the moon. Those of you who are fans of Good Morning America on ABC, you might remember the anchor, Robin Roberts, who was telling her audience that the prayer for protection was her daily morning prayer, and how it helped her to get through her medical procedures that she was undergoing for that long fight that she had with breast cancer. She took the prayer and she turned it into a bracelet, and the bracelet has those words on it. It has the words light, love, power, and presence on it. And it got a lot of attention. But you know what? Nobody ever made the unity connection. Isn't that interesting? It's kind of unfortunate, I guess, but that just means that we have to rely on karma, because it isn't so much a matter of getting credit for something as it is to see the good that something like this accomplishes in the world. That's where we need to place our focus. So some of you might be thinking to yourselves, well, what about that other line? What about that last line? Because in some unity centers, there's a 6th line that was added to the prayer for protection, the one that says, "and all is well." Jim Freeman didn't write that, and I have no idea where the line came from. We don't use it here because I don't think that it really adds anything to the prayer. So, how is the really not so old prayer for protection holding up? How well is it standing the test of time? Something I've always noticed about it is that it sounds a little bit anthropomorphic, maybe even a little bit dualistic. It seems to describe God as a being out there who sends down light, love, power, protection, the light of God, the love of God, kind of setting up a little distance there. And that's not so bad, but then we get to the line, the presence of God watching over us. That's almost like a description of a human activity, very human attributes, which kind of seems to be a little bit at odds with some of our basic teachings. One of our oldest and clearest ways of describing what we mean when we use the word God comes from a book called Lessons in Truth, which was compiled in the late 1800s, written by Emily Cady. And here's how she describes God. She says, God is spirit, or the creative energy that is the cause of all visible things. God as spirit is the invisible life and intelligence underlying all physical things. God is not a being or person having life, intelligence, love, power. God is that invisible, intangible, but very real something we call life. Okay, so we read the prayer for protection after hearing that, and we end up with a little bit of what they call cognitive dissonance, right? There's something that's a little bit at odds there, and I'm not the only one who's noticed that. Others have brought it to my attention. And one of the things that I point out is that Jim Freeman was a poet, not a theologian. I think he had more in common with a Zen master presenting a koan for students to chew on, right? Of course there's no God guy out there sending stuff to us or watching over us like a security guard, or Karen said it sounds like Santa Claus, watching over us. It sees you when you're sleeping, knows when you're awake, whatever. It's a metaphor. It's symbolism. And Emily Cady recognized that there was kind of a big problem with her way of describing God. There was a big problem then for many people, and there still is a bit of a problem today. And here's how she puts it. She says, God as the underlying substance of all things, God as principle is unchanging and does remain forever uncognizant of and unmoved by the changing things of time and sense. Okay? Let's unpack that a little bit. What she's really kind of saying there is that God don't care about your problems. That's what she's kind of saying there. God as principle, all right? And then she recognizes, she says, many have thought of God as a personal being. The statement that God is principle chills them. And in terror they cry out, they have taken away my Lord, and I know not where they have laid him. That's a verse from the Gospel of John when they came to the empty tomb. They have taken my Lord, and I know not where to find them. Now, what she's teaching up there still holds up as metaphysical, theological truth. It works. And yet, there's that reaction that people have and still have today. It's a very human reaction. And that's the reason why I think people still insist on turning God into something personal, a personal being. It's comfortable. It's comforting. And I came across a paragraph by another one of my favorite authors that I think really explains why we do that. Here it is. Birth, life, death. The cycles and rhythms of nature, the elemental forces of the universe. These are inescapably real. Like it or not, we have always found ourselves in relationship with a reality we could neither predict nor control. And given the nature of the human brain, there is one thing that people in every culture and throughout history have instinctively done. We've used metaphors and analogies to refer and relate to that which is unavoidably, undeniably real and or mysterious. Indeed, it seems that we can't not do this. Michael Dowd wrote the book, Thank God for Evolution, which we've worked with here before. And boy, that about sums it up as well as anything that I could have come up with. Human beings, we use mythical and symbolic language to interpret reality and to try to make sense out of things that we have difficulty making sense out of. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with doing that as long as we're aware that that's what we're doing. In fact, I think it's good to remind ourselves that human beings have this instinctive need to personify reality in order to be able to relate to it on another level, and that includes personifying the concept of God. There is a great Jungian psychologist, James Hillman, who said that personifying is the heart's mode of knowing. Personifying is the heart's mode of knowing. Every culture has its own version of personifying God, personifying reality. That's why there's so much diversity. when it comes to religion and spirituality around the world. And if we cling to the personification, if we cling to the symbolism and insist that it's the absolute truth, then we're going to have conflict. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that we have to go to the opposite extreme and throw it all out. You know, the neat thing about symbolic personifications like the prayer for protection, they're easy to remember. They're easy to memorize, and they fit neatly in your pocket, just like it did for soldiers on a battlefield, an astronaut getting ready to step onto the moon, or a woman going through chemo and bone marrow transplants. That's how it works. The prayer for protection is the mythical, symbolic language that's trying to capture a greater truth using shorthand. Michael Dowd refers to that as night language, language of the dream world, where things come to us in symbols and metaphor, symbolic night language that we're trying to use to capture a greater truth using shorthand. So once again, Emily Cady, she describes the greater truth in a little more detail. She says the ultimate aim of every man should be to come into the consciousness of an indwelling God, and then in all external matters to affirm deliverance through and by this divine one. There should not be a running to and fro, making human efforts to aid the divine, but a calm, restful, unwavering trust in all wisdom and all power within one as able to accomplish the thing desired. There's the greater truth. I added the italics because I think those are the key ideas here. There's nothing wrong or inconsistent with the prayer for protection in all of that, as long as we're willing to see it as an interpretive stepping stone that we use to help us to arrive at that place of what she calls that calm, unwavering trust in principle that the symbolic language is pointing to. Mythical language, poetry, it's always an invitation to go deeper, to go beyond the superficial meaning of words, and maybe eventually let go of the words altogether and trust the experience, the reality itself, stepping stones. So, the next time you hear or recite the prayer for protection, I would invite you to do it from that consciousness, with the idea that it's a stepping stone, that it's mythical, symbolic language that serves a purpose, and then take some time later in your life to go beyond that. Take some time to practice that, and you're going to be getting an opportunity here in about 5 minutes to do exactly that, because I'm done, and we'll see you next Sunday. Thank you. Thank you.